Praise be to God. I hope you're not depressed yet, because we're just about to start. In Ecclesiastes, the book of Ecclesiastes is a mixed bag. It's a mixed bag. It has some good in it, but also some bad. And that's just characteristic of wisdom literature as a whole. Not everything that you will read in the wisdom books is positive. Not everything that you will read in the wisdom books is prescriptive. Wisdom literature forces you to think. Tim Keller says it is the hard candy of the Word. So you have the pure milk of the Word, you have solid food, the meat of the Word, and then you have hard candy. And that's how wisdom literature is. I think, in fact, to extend the analogy a bit, it's chewing gum. It's the chewing gum of the Word. Okay? You chew and chew and chew and chew. You don't swallow everything, because it's a mix of good and bad. You swallow the good, but you spit out the bad. Because if you swallow your chewing gum, it's going to cause your internal organs to all stick together. Today, we continue questing with Kohelet as he meditates on life under the sun. We've mentioned this for the past few weeks. We need to always remember Kohelet here is questing within the framework of a person who is under the sun. Okay, that is a person without a God principle, a person who is questing apart from a view of the goodness and greatness of God as the only hope and help of sinners. That's what under the sun means. Okay, so before you pass judgment on Kohelet and says this is a heathen speaking, well, actually he's speaking as a heathen, and that's why it's very important to always keep that in mind. It's under the sun. Kohelet's recurring verdict in the book is this, and we've said this over and over again: vanity of vanities. It is havel. It is vapor, striving after wind. Everything under the sun, it's pointless, it's fleeting, ephemeral. In fact, it is absurd. In the passage today that we're looking at, you're not going to see a lot of that language. He's not going to say vanity of vanities, but he's going to say something else. Okay? Today, the passage is divided into a cluster of, this chapter actually is divided into a cluster of 5 sections dealing with the human condition. They are loosely connected to each other, but might strike us as random at first look. Close examination, however, reveals to us that there is a unifying theme. And this theme is what we'll be calling the better than theme. Okay? There's actually a neat literary pattern and structure that's too good not to mention. If you look at this chapter, like I said, there are 5 clusters in the chapter, in the section. The first 2 sections, verses 1 to 3 and verses 4 to 6, the better than sayings occur at the end. You see that? And then the last 2 sections, verses 9 to 12 and verses 13 to 16, the better than sayings occur at the beginning. The middle section, which is verse 7 to 8, does not have a better than section. Does not have a better than saying. Okay? But that's the neat structure that you find here. After all, the Bible is beautiful literature. The first 2 sections, the better than comes at the end. The last 2 sections, the better than comes at the beginning. And then the middle part doesn't have a better than. But that's a unifying theme that we see in this whole chapter. Now, I've entitled my sermon, Just a Few Tragedies Under the Sun. Just a few. Okay? It's not all of it. And that's what Kohelet is trying to show us here in this passage. He is by no means thorough, as he does not deal with all manners of tragedies present in life on earth. He is concerned particularly with what he has observed to be some of the tragedies that plague the human condition. And the introduction of better than sayings provides a contrast to the overall backdrop of vanity of vanities. At first, reading this passage, one might be tempted to think that Kohelet is actually praising some things under the sun. But soon we realize that the relative good, or the better than, is just not good enough. That's what he's saying. The greatest tragedy under the sun, Kohelet seems to be driving this point to us in this chapter, is that the relative good is still not good enough. And not good enough is not good enough. In the final analysis, even the better than is still not better enough. It is still vanity, just like the rest. Now, I mentioned there are 5 sections to today's passage, and I know that in the past weeks we've done 3 points, we've done 4 points, we've done 2 points, and you're probably expecting we're going to do 5 points today, but don't worry, we're not going to do that. We're just going to do 4. Okay? This is printed on page 3 of your bulletin. Okay, these are the headings under which we will examine this text. Number 1, the tragedy of existence. Number 2, the tragedy of competition. Number 3, the tragedy of solitude. And number 4, the tragedy of aging. And for the kids, if you look at page 3, you're not going to see a keyword, because the keyword I'd like you to remember, little kids, when you go home, it might be a word that you don't understand now. That's why I want you to go home and ask your parents. The word is tragedy. What does Pastor mean by the word tragedy? And why is the passage today about tragedy? Am I a tragedy, Papa? Okay? And so go home and talk to your parents about the passage. Keep that word in mind, tragedy. Look at the first point now. The tragedy of existence. And this corresponds to verses 1 to 3 here in chapter 4. Again, I saw all the oppressions that are done under the sun, and behold the tears of the oppressed, and they had no one to comfort them. On the side of their oppressors there was power, and there was no one to comfort them. And I thought the dead who are already dead are more fortunate than the living who are still alive. But better than both is he who has not yet been born, or who has not yet been, and has not seen the evil deeds that are done under the sun. Now, last week we considered that under the sun, the reality is justice and righteousness are nowhere to be found. That's what we looked at last week. The problem of justice is that it is actually injustice. Okay? Kohelet seems to be picking up on that theme at the end of chapter 3, here in chapter 4, with this first section. Kohelet reflects upon a tragedy that is sadly all too familiar to us. It was true in Kohelet's day, and sadly it is true even today. Again, I saw, verse 1, all the oppressions that are done under the sun, and behold the tears of the oppressed. Behold the tears of the oppressed. And they had no one to comfort them. On the side of their oppressors was power, and there was no one to comfort them. Oppression was everywhere. One might say oppression is still everywhere. It's being perpetuated by the strong against the weak. And the oppressed are in tears. Maybe not physical tears, but their hearts are weeping. And the oppressed, they have no one to comfort them. He says this twice, and there is no one to comfort them. And this focus on the tears, he says, behold tears of the oppressed. It denotes strong emotions of grief and despair. The weak who are unable to defend themselves and are in tears have no one to come to their aid. But why? That's a question to ask. Oppression is everywhere. And behold the tears of the oppressed. There's no one to comfort them. There is no one to comfort them. The repetition is emphatic. But the question to ask is, why does oppression exist? Why does oppression? Have you ever stopped to think about that? Why does oppression exist? Why do the strong eat up the weak? Why does the rich exploit the poor? Particularly poignant for those of you who are working in the fight against human trafficking. Why do people do that? It's not like powerful people wake up in the morning thinking, I wonder who I will oppress today. Or I wonder how I can most effectively exploit and prejudice someone today. One might say oppression exists because of sin. And of course there are oppressors, they're sinners. We're all sinners. Yes, that's true. But I think that's too simplistic. That's too broad of a reason. Why, for example, do criminal syndicates engage in illegal activities like dealing in drugs or prostitution that directly destroy the lives of people who become their victims? Sit down. For the most part, I think the oppressor knows that what they are doing is wrong. Right? People who do acts like that, people who exploit other people, people who oppress, people who are corrupt, they know that's wrong. I think they know that. They're not that naive. But still they do it because at the end of the day, they rationalize it. Oh, it's just business. There's always casualty in these kind of things. It's all just business. It's all about the money. So people don't really exploit or oppress others as an end in itself, but always as a means to an end. And that end is usually money. Greed is what causes oppressions. Self-interest is what causes exploitations. One other reason for oppression is prejudice. People oppress others based on a self-perceived superiority over them. We think we are worth more than they are. We're entitled to far better things than they are. That we are, in a sense, more human than they are. We are more privileged, more educated, we're more intelligent, we're more resourced, more civilized, more powerful, more skillful, etc., etc. And gets to your head. It gets to our head. That's why we prejudice people. That's why we oppress people. And as a result, we oppress and we bully. That's the thing. In verse 2, Kohelet asserts that the dead are better off than the living. Not because death is a happy prospect for those who are suffering, but because the dead can no longer suffer. You see how grim that is? He says, the dead are better off because their suffering has ended. Their experience of oppression is finished. Notice that he doesn't just say the dead who were once oppressed, but the dead in general. The tragedy of oppression is so universal and pervasive that only the dead do not experience it. It's the sad reality under the sun. Everybody experiences oppression one way or another. Even siblings do that, and I am witness to that from time to time. And you know that well if you are not an only child. Right? And finally, in verse 3, Kohelet offers his better than statement. And this is really curious. He says, but better than both, the one who's alive and the one who's dead, is he who has not yet been and has not seen the evil deeds that are done under the sun. The dead are better off than the living because they can no longer be oppressed. But still, the fact remains that while they still lived, they suffered oppression. That's not good. And thus, what is better is to not have been born at all. What Kohelet says. The unborn are better off because they have neither seen nor are they experiencing these evils that are being done under the sun. Application: married couples don't have kids. You're bringing them into a world of suffering and oppression. How cruel of you! That very act of birthing them is an oppression in itself. Under the sun, that's what you're going to do. Kohelet's better alternative is an impossibility. What is better is unattainable. If you're suffering oppression now, you might wish for death to end it all. Some people do that. They take their life into their own hands to end it. But then that's not the best. Under the sun, that's not even the better thing to do. Under the sun, it's better that you were never born at all. An impossibility. Unattainable. And that is the tragedy of existence under the sun. As long as we live, we will be subject to, we will be witnesses to, we will be authors of oppression. And there is no one to comfort the oppressed. Existence is tragic under the sun. That's point number one. Point number two, tragedy of competition. Now the second tragedy that Kohelet shows us is competition. Look at verses 3 to 4. He says, verses 4 to 6. Then I saw that all toil and all skill in work come from a man's envy of his neighbor. This also is vanity and a striving after wind. The fool folds his hands and eats his own flesh. Better is a handful of quietness than 2 hands full of toil and a striving after wind. Kohelet tells us that the motivation behind all toil or workaholism and skill is really just envy. The reason why you're trying to hit that target, that quota, the reason why you're trying to be employee of the month, it's because of envy. The reason why you want to earn more is because you see somebody who's earning more than you and you want to be there. It doesn't really matter whether you're a businessman, a social worker, a professional, a teacher, a lawyer, a pastor, a student, or whatever industry you might be in. Competition and envy is what drives industry. For the sake of being ahead of your competition, your toiling will push you to your limits. But note well, even if you succeed in surpassing your rival, you will never have peace. The thought of being overtaken will constantly haunt you, and it will only drive you further into workaholism. Competition and rivalry, when it is born out of envy, is self-destructive. And when that day finally comes, when you get beat at your game, by someone better and younger, you will be bitter and angry and utterly destroyed. I remember we have a family friend. His dad is, well, you can call him a taipan. They're quite wealthy. Okay, they own a paper company, and the father has always involved himself in the Chamber of Commerce. Okay, and in the Chamber of Commerce, he's worked his way up. You know, he's chummied up with the big wigs. He's rubbed shoulders with other rich and powerful business people because he has always set his sights on becoming the president of the Filipino-Chinese Chamber of Commerce. Okay, and then when his turn came, when he expected to be elected, the anointing didn't come on him. It fell on another guy who was one of, you can say, one of the guys of one of the richest Filipinos who owns an airline. And it crushed him. He was working all his life towards that goal. It wasn't about the money even. He was driven by the envy, by the prospect of that prestige. And he was beat. And he was utterly destroyed because of that. Kohelet tells us that when work becomes toil, it becomes vanity and a striving after wind. You see, when people do not have a proper sense and understanding of vision, of mission or vocation, then their occupations will either just drive them over to overexertion in order to stay on top, or it will drain them of all motivation and just cause them to be idle and do nothing. Either extreme is no good, according to Kohelet. And that's why here at Pilgrim we talk about the gospel-shaped life. We're very concerned, our vision says it, we are committed to cultivating Christ-centered communities where lives and mission are shaped by the gospel for the good of the city, the world, the city, the nation, the world. Okay. Now, the gospel changes everything. Our toil is changed to meaningful rest-driven work. But you have to have that concept. But under the sun, there's none of that. Under the sun, there's just competition. There's just one-upmanship. It's a dog-eat-dog world out there. Dogs don't eat dog. Now, idleness is just as dumb, according to Kohelet, and just as self-destructive as toiling. So you think, okay, I'm tired of all this toiling, I'm tired of all this competition, I'm just tired, I don't want to do it anymore. I know what I'm going to do, I'm going to stop. It's just as dumb and self-destructive, according to Kohelet. And the imagery he uses is quite funny, it's vivid. If you don't work, you won't have money. If you don't have money, you won't be able to buy food. If you don't buy food, you won't be able to eat. If you don't eat, you'll starve. And if you starve, you'll die. Simple logic. And so he says, fold your hands, and you might as well just cannibalize yourself. He says, the fool folds his hands and eats his own flesh. Verse 5. And then in verse 6, Kohelet pronounces another better than statement. He says, better is a handful of quietness than 2 hands full of toil and a striving after wind. And you think about that, and yeah, that's true. You know, be a bit content with what you have. Be happy with quietness rather than, you know, strive and strive and strive and strive and kill yourself doing it. But again, it's better than, it's not the best. Under the sun, that's all you get. Sometimes Kohelet tells us, less is more. A handful earned through quiet, diligent work is better than 2 handfuls earned through vain toiling. And the solution, it seems, is to reject the envy-driven view of toil. But then you have to ask him, Kohelet, that's good, but how? How do you do that? He doesn't tell us. The answer, it seems, is nowhere to be found under the sun. And so that's a tragedy of competition. The next tragedy is a tragedy of solitude. And for this, we will be considering the next 2 sections in this passage, which Kohelet introduces to us beforehand as more vanity under the sun. Look at verses 7 to 12. He says, again, I saw vanity under the sun. One person who has no other, forever single, either son or brother, yet there is no end to all his toil. And his eyes are never satisfied with riches, so that he never asks, for whom am I toiling and depriving myself of pleasures? This also is vanity and an unhappy business. 2 are better than 1 because they have a good reward for their toil. For if they fall, one will lift up his fellow. But woe to him who is alone when he falls and has not another to lift him up. Again, if 2 lie together, they keep warm. But how can one keep warm alone? And though a man might prevail against one who is alone, 2 will withstand him. A threefold cord is not quickly broken. And so, first you see a picture of self-inflicted solitude, as it were, because of toiling. Career before relationship. It's all about making a mark in my industry. Work. But never stopping to think, okay, I've amassed so much, I've earned so much, but who will I leave it to? The first section being, the middle section seems to bridge the concern of toiling with that of solitude. Here we see a man who works incessantly. He evidently has wealth, which doesn't seem to satisfy him. He can't buy happiness. But he has neither kin nor friends. He has no siblings nor children of his own who could inherit his riches. Yet he keeps toiling. This kind of solitude is self-inflicted and is brought about by greed and ambition. This man is so motivated by greed, Kohelet tells us, that he doesn't even bother to stop and think, for whom am I toiling and depriving myself of pleasure? In his devotion to working and earning money, he doesn't even spend on himself. He doesn't enjoy the fruit of his labor. And this is a vanity and an unhappy business, Kohelet says. A lot of traditional business people are just like this. They're too busy building the empire. There's little time to enjoy. But you see, many of them, they don't know it's because they're driven by greed. Because greed is tricky. It's very subtle. Greed is very subtle, you know. It's not like adultery. It's not like, you know, adultery is never subtle. It's not like you wake up one morning and you go, oh, who are you? What has happened last night? You know, you know it. But greed, it's like that. Creeps up. It's very subtle. And each of us, we are the best in rationalizing away our own greed. And so it's tricky. The reality is we are always in the company of people richer than us. Why? Because if the reason why we are surrounded by people who are richer than us is because you want to be like them. So you surround yourself with people who are, not so much richer, but a bit richer than you, so that you have something that you're always aspiring towards. And so we're never satisfied. And this is exactly the case of this first man. But worse and more tragic is the fact that he is completely alone. But I bet he's rationalizing it too. He's saying, Who needs relationships? I'm married to my work. And my work never nags me. In the next section, in verses 9 to 12, Kohelet takes us from the corporate world now out into the wild. A hike in the woods. Now, it was not uncommon in ancient times for travelers to have to go through thick forests and woods en route to their destinations. In such cases, it is safer and much wiser to travel with companions. This seems to be the context of Kohelet's next observations. He begins by stating his better than saying, then he gives 3 examples. So look at verse 9. He says, 2 are better than 1 because they have a good reward for their toil. And then he gives the examples. The overall idea is that it's better to have company with you when you travel. If in the course of walking, one falls into a pit, the other one can lift him up and pull him out. What a pity it would be if one falls and has no one to help him. The second example may sound weird to us today, but it made perfect sense to travelers out in the open. Sometimes you'd be traveling in the woods and then night will overtake you. And so you'll have to pitch a tent and or find some shelter and sleep. And it gets cold. Okay, and that's the context of it. There's nothing sexual about this. There's nothing malicious. It's just you're traveling. You're two pals travel together. Okay, it's nighttime, and you keep each other warm in the night, through the night. Having a companion to sleep beside is better for keeping warm than being alone out in the cold at night. And lastly, Kohelet says in verse 11, he says, again, if 2 lie together, they keep warm, but how can one keep warm alone? And verse 12, and though a man might prevail against one who is alone, 2 will withstand him, a threefold cord is not quickly broken. Should a robber or an assailant attack, having a companion gives one a better chance of withstanding or defeating the adversary. And so 2 are better than 1. And the illustrations are drawn from the idea of traveling through thick forests. Kohelet suggests that it is much more advantageous to have a companion in our journeys in life. To travel alone or to go about life alone is a tragedy that is at once ill-advised and pitiful. He rounds up this bit of wisdom by stating a familiar proverb. That's the verse 12. And it gets quoted a lot, right? A threefold cord is not quickly broken. There is strength in numbers. And cooperation and company is better by far than solitude. And there's truth here also for our spiritual journeys. We are all pilgrims on the way, in search for meaning, in search for purpose, in search for truth. But as we journey, it is important who we journey with. Those of you who've read The Pilgrim's Progress know this quite well, don't you? Those who are familiar with the story. Christian, as he travels along, meets with companions left and right. Some are good, some are bad. And bad company derails him. But good company helps him along in his journey. And so, it is good to have companions in your journeys in life. But who you journey with is important. It is as much a tragedy to do things on our own in our endeavors as it is when you set out to find truth for yourself. So here at Pilgrim, we recognize that every person is on a journey. We are each at a different stage in life, facing different challenges, asking different questions, and having different struggles. But the important thing is not to travel alone. We recognize that who you travel with is very important. And that is why we would like to journey with you. That's our unofficial tagline. Hashtag here to journey with you. So if you're new here, I'd like to encourage you to keep coming. We are not here to force our ideas on you, but to help you think through the implications of the Christian faith on your life. Keep dialoguing with us, ask your questions. We're here as fellow pilgrims to journey with you. But going back, the tragedy of solitude is not having anyone to travel with. Last, the tragedy of aging. You know, I preached this in 2012 or 2013, 4 years ago. And this last point wasn't as, as real to me back then. But now I've aged 4 years. And so I see the tragedy in it all the more. The last kind of tragedy that we see in this passage is the tragedy of aging. This last section also begins with a better than saying and contrasts two people, a poor but wise youth and an old, experienced but foolish, senile king. Look at verse 13. Better was a poor and wise youth than an old and foolish king who no longer knew how to take advice. The obvious comparison here is between the wisdom of the youth and the folly of the king. Clearly, wisdom is preferred. And it's a bit ironic, isn't it? Because elsewhere in the wisdom literature, old age is prized because wisdom comes with age. But see, again, this illustrates to us the reality that not everything in wisdom literature is prescriptive or positive. Because it's not guaranteed. Just because you're older doesn't mean you're wiser. Okay? And then you see that right here with the king. What is curious about this section is how Kohelet seems to be alluding to a historical figure, to historical figures as object lessons for what he is trying to say. Now, commentators and scholars have tried unsuccessfully to identify this poor young man and this old king. There doesn't seem to be any need, in my opinion, to do so, and any attempts would only take away from the main point that Kohelet is driving at. And so, whether this poor young man and the king are historical figures, really doesn't, whether we know the identity of them, it really doesn't take away from what he's trying to point out, which is the tragedy of age. Notice verse 14. The young man was really poor. He was in prison. But we're not told that he had a crime. He was actually in prison, most likely because of poverty, as a way to pay off debt. And that's how it worked in ancient civilizations. Particularly in the ancient Near East, there were, if you owed somebody money and you couldn't pay for it, then you are put in prison. Okay? And you do time, and then you're able to pay for it. Something like that. Okay? And so this young man was really poor. He was in prison because of the debt and because of poverty. Okay? And Kohelet tells us that by some providential turn of events, this young man succeeds as king after the old foolish king of whom we do not learn any more about. Then in verses 15, in the first part of verse 16, Kohelet describes the huge following that this new young ruler amasses. He says, there is no end of all the people, all of whom he led. The wise young ruler eventually becomes very popular and had a large following. One cannot help but assume that this young ruler, who was wise, well, he ruled well and was a wise king. But then, second part of verse 16 tells us, yet those who come later will not rejoice in him. Surely this also is vanity and a striving after wind. The later generations do not regard him as the former generations. And the reality is that this once young and wise man who became king also will one day become old and possibly even foolish. And though he started small and then eventually become great, yet in his old age he too will be rejected. Kohelet observes this and exclaims, "Surely this also is vanity and a striving after wind." The tragedy of aging is this: none of us is foolproof. You may be wise now. You may be becoming wise as the years pass. But as long as you're alive, you're not foolproof. You can still end up a fool. And that's a tragedy. The tragedy of aging under the sun is that we grow older, and we too will almost certainly be replaced. And so we've seen 4 tragedies, just a few. These aren't all of the tragedies under the sun. These are just a few of the tragedies under the sun. And we should thank God that just gave us 5, because otherwise we'd be all the more despairing after reading this. Just a few tragedies: the tragedy of existence, the tragedy of competition, the tragedy of solitude, and the tragedy of aging. So what do we get from all these tragedies that Kohelet is showing us under the sun? Like we said when we began, Kohelet's point in this passage seems to be that the greatest tragedy under the sun is that the relatively good, or the relative good, is still not good enough. Better than. But not best. Under the sun, there's no best, only better than. Mas okay na yan. Mas okay na yan. Ganito. Ganyan. That's all you get under the sun. That's what Kohelet said. While certain things may seem better in light of the alternatives, yet better is not really much better. It's like, it's the lesser evil. It is better, he says, to not have been born rather than to be born and die and still have seen evil and misery, or to be alive and to experience oppression and hardship by the hands of others. But the alternative he praises is impossible. You cannot unborn yourself. Kohelet says that sometimes less is more. 1 is better than 2. It's better to earn less quietly than to earn more and be filled with toil and strife. But how does one do that? Where does one find the motivation for good, honest work apart from envy and competition? Not under the sun. Kohelet says that company is always better than solitude as we journey through life. In this case, 2 is better than 1. But the question is, who is to show the way? How do we know whose company to take? Kohelet says that it is better to be young than to be old. But the problem is that youth is fleeting. The young today will be old tomorrow. You'll be older tomorrow. Did you know that? What Kohelet says is better doesn't seem all too good in the long run. The relatively good is still not good enough. And these better than sayings don't seem to provide any hope under the sun than the already grim refrain that we've heard time and time again from Kohelet. Vanity of vanities, all is vanity and a striving after wind. So is there a better way than the better than? Last week we ended with the heading, "This is as good as it gets." That's what we said last week. It seems this passage is forcing us to the same conclusion once again. Life under the sun is tragic, and what's more tragic is that there really is nothing better under the sun, because better is not really better. But the good news, and there is good news, the good news is that beyond the sun, there is something better. There is comfort for the oppressed. There is a better alternative to envy-driven toil. There is a companion who's fallen once in our place, but will never fall again, and will always be there to lift us up. There is one who reverses the effects of aging and death and offers life eternal. In all of these tragedies, what Kohelet proposes as better under the sun still falls short of what really is good. Beyond the sun, God has a better, much better provision for the fallen human condition. Jesus Christ came into the world and was subject to oppression and exploitation. And there was no one to comfort him. There was no one to comfort him. He was rejected by men and ultimately by his Father at the cross. Jesus Christ came and redefined what it means to work. Not as toil, which is rooted in envy and which constantly strives to be good enough. In Jesus, believers are restored to their creational design, and that is to do good work for His honor. God created human beings to do good work, to contribute to human flourishing, and to make much of our Creator. But sin ruined this for us. Now in Jesus, because He has done the ultimate work of saving sinners, the one work that really counts, those who repent and believe in Him are enabled by His resurrection power to really do work in quietness and shalom. Jesus Christ came as the ultimate pilgrim. He traveled through the dark forest of sin and death, was fallen on account of us, but emerged victorious on the third day by His resurrection from the grave. Now He is our ever-dependent companion, who is always there to lift us up when we fall. He is our companion who is in us and is greater than the enemy who is in the world. Jesus is a wise young man of humble beginnings, born poor in the world, but who now is king and reigns over all the world. To hope in Jesus is to hope that all the tragedies we know of under the sun will one day be reversed and obliterated. Not just these few ones, but all the tragedies we know and experience under the sun. One day will be no more. This is because the greatest tragedy to have ever happened in history is also our greatest hope. The tragedy of an innocent Savior dying on the cross for the sins of His people is the greatest hope that sinners like us can have. Because Jesus dealt with the greatest problem of sin and death on the cross, we have hope that one day all that is tragic under the sun will be made right. To the extent that this is real in our lives, to that extent, the tragedies of existence, competition, solitude, and aging begin to be reversed in our lives. Then we can truly say what Kohelet was not able to say in our passage today. There is something better that is not just better, but the best. The Lord Jesus Christ, whose tragic life, death, and resurrection is our hope for glory. And so as we close, I am reminded again of that short phrase that we were considering 2 weeks ago in our CDG in the book of Hebrews. Consider Jesus. Consider Him. You look around and all you see is tragedy, and all you can hope for under the sun is the better than. Lift your eyes, consider Jesus. He is not just better than all others, He is the very best.